So the objective in this video is to test your interviewing skills by asking you 3 sample interview questions. And the better you can answer these questions on the spot, the more prepared you are for a behavioral interview in particular. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, what's your weakness? Okay, so for some reason, people struggle answering these types of what's your weakness, what's your strength type of questions. They are still quite popular these days, and just want to ask you, do you have an answer in mind for this? Now, if you do have an answer in mind, I would like to also share with you a little bit of insight on what makes a great answer for your weakness. So a great answer is not as much about your weakness as it is about the story you'd like to talk about to highlight that weakness. Okay, so probably the most common example by far of a weakness for a candidate in a job interview is public speaking. And if you use public speaking, you won't get disqualified, right? But you know, your interviewer will be familiar with these types of weaknesses. And as I just said, it's about the story, not about the weakness as much. Okay, so for example, if for public speaking, if you use a story such as, well, you know, public speaking is not one of my core strengths. Now, don't get me wrong, I did have recently a public speaking engagement, but it was because my boss had asked me to do it, and it was on short notice. And for this, I actually prepared. I asked for some tips from some of my friends who are more skilled with these things, and it went well. But generally, I prefer speaking to crowds of known people as compared to speaking of larger crowds of unknown people. So this is something you could use for your story to highlight on this public speaking as a weakness, right? This was the first question. Now, the second question would be, how do you deal with conflict, right? So these are quite common questions in pretty much any job interview with any company. And the first thing you must keep in mind here, they are difficult to spot. I mean, if I would ask you, tell me about the last time you had a conflict with a colleague, then it's pretty obvious they are looking to screen for your interpersonal skills. But if I ask you something on the lines of, tell me about the last interaction you had with, or cross-functionally if you want, it's not that obvious that if they ask you for a cross-functional collaboration, they are interested in your interpersonal skills as well, right? So spotting the question, spotting why they ask you the question is also a valid thing for you to screen for while interviewing with any company. And you can also make a separate test to ask yourself various questions, or take the top 20 most commonly asked interview questions and see why they're asking you this for the purpose of job interview. And if you spot why, then you know you're significantly more likely to answer these well, okay? Now, what mistakes do people do when answering questions around interpersonal skills? Well, the first and most common is that you put the blame on someone. You put the blame on your colleague, on your company. I'm not happy with how things move there. Things are too slow, so I'm looking for a change. These types of things, or you outright publicly shame another employee of that company, another coworker, if you want. These are the most common mistakes. Now, of course, you know, if you're more of a people's person, then you'll know you'll be in a far better spot to answer such questions. But especially technical people struggle answering these types of questions, and they also tend to, you know, put the blame, especially if you don't prepare for it in advance, then the risk is even higher, right? So do you have a story in mind for this, and how would you evaluate the quality of your answer, given what I said here? Okay, so also what I would recommend you here is to prepare 3 examples of conflicts with people, because these questions around interpersonal relationships can come up in many shapes and forms. Like I just said, tell me about your latest interaction cross-functionally, or a time when you disagree with a coworker, or a time when you had to influence an outcome, and how did you go about it. This is also, you know, not just about I use data and the data clarified everything, but also a little bit about interpersonal skills. So that's why I would recommend you to prepare 3 examples of stories on this topic of dealing with conflict. And by the way, also for the weakness, right? It could be a simple follow-up. What's your second weakness? Okay, or can you give me 3 examples of weaknesses? Okay, so it could also go on variation. So this was the second around conflict. Now, the third question, and finally here, how do you deal with failure? What's your worst failure? Okay, so do you have something in mind here? Now, my experience as a coach, I can tell you that it will take around 3 attempts to find the proper failure, right? Because it's slightly uncomfortable to talk about failures, except if you have some great learnings to use, right? So now on the mistakes you want to avoid with failures is probably the most common of them is to talk about a failure which I just got fired from my recent role, so I'm looking for a new opportunity, right? This is not a type of failure you'd like to talk in a job interview because it's basically too dangerous. It happened to it's too recent, right? Or another mistake is people try to fake the failure to minimize the impact of a failure, to make up a failure story just for the purpose of a job interview, which again, for a skilled interviewer, is quite easy to spot if someone is making things up or minimizing impact, or it's basically a sign that you don't know how to answer these failure stories, right? The best way to answer the failure story is to spend half of the time talking about the learnings. The second half of your answers will be your learnings, and to talk about actual impact. Real life examples are never perfect, and this actually usually makes your answers more credible, right? So this was what I wanted to share with you. So weakness, interpersonal, and failure, right? So how well would you score your answers for these types of questions? I believe if you score well on these 3, then you are already in a pretty good spot to interview and to handle an intense behavioral interview. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.